The abyssal diver surfaced just after midnight, its reinforced hull streaked with deep-sea sediment and faint scratches no one could explain. Emily watched through the sub's viewport as the lights of the Nereus Explorer appeared on the surface, a beacon of safety in the otherwise endless blackness of the ocean. Relief washed over her as the crane lifted the sub onto the deck, but that relief was short-lived. Inside the sub's containment unit was the sample they'd collected, a fragment of the glowing lattice. It pulsed faintly, its rhythmic glow casting eerie, shifting shadows across the lab walls as it was wheeled inside. Emily felt a growing unease as she watched Lena and Marcus secure it in the isolation chamber. "This thing is alive, no question," Lena said, her voice filled with scientific fervor. She leaned over the containment chamber, her face bathed in the organism's faint blue light. "Look at these filaments. They're structured like neural pathways. It's like this thing is thinking." Emily frowned, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. "Thinking? That's a stretch?" Lena turned to her, undeterred. "Why not? Deep-sea organisms have evolved in ways we can't begin to comprehend. The electrical signals it's emitting are consistent with bioelectrical activity. It could be some kind of distributed brain." Marcus leaned back against the counter, his expression skeptical. "So what? It's a giant jellyfish with homework." Lena ignored him, turning back to the chamber. "We need to run a full analysis. This could be the discovery of the century." Emily didn't respond. She couldn't shake the feeling that the lattice, this strange alien organism, was aware of them, watching them. The trouble began that night. Emily was jolted awake by a piercing hum that seemed to vibrate through the ship's hull. She sat up in her bunk, heart pounding, and looked around the dark cabin. The hum faded, leaving behind an oppressive silence. She dismissed it as a dream, just the stress of the mission catching up with her. But the next morning, Lena arrived in the lab with dark circles under her eyes, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of coffee. "Did you hear it last night?" she asked quietly. "Hear what?" Marcus asked, already elbow-deep in the sub's maintenance systems. "That sound," Lena said. "It was like a low hum, but it felt like it was inside my head." Marcus shrugged. "Probably the engines. You know how this old tub likes to creak and groan." Lena didn't argue, but Emily noticed her glancing nervously at the containment chamber. The sample was brighter now, its glow pulsing faster than before. Emily made a mental note to report the strange behavior to the mission coordinator once they re-established communications with the mainland. By midday, more anomalies surfaced. The ship's lights flickered erratically, and the sonar equipment began emitting strange, irregular pings that the crew couldn't trace. Worse, the sample's glow seemed to affect the surrounding lab equipment. Monitors displayed distorted readings, and one of the microscopes simply stopped working. "This thing is messing with the electronics," Marcus grumbled, tapping the side of a malfunctioning screen. Emily watched the sample, unease growing. "It's like it's reacting to us," she said quietly, "feeding off our presence." That night, the nightmares began. Emily dreamt she was back in the trench, floating weightless in the abyss. The glowing lattice stretched out before her, its tendrils moving like fingers reaching for her. As they touched her skin, she felt a searing pain, her flesh unraveling into strands of glowing light. She tried to scream, but the ocean swallowed her voice. She woke drenched in sweat, her hands clutching the sheets so tightly her knuckles ached. Across the hall, she heard Lena scream. Emily rushed to Lena's cabin, finding her curled up on the floor, trembling. "They were pulling at me," Lena whispered, her voice hoarse, "tearing me apart." Emily knelt beside her, trying to calm her. "It was just a nightmare," she said, though her own trembling hands betrayed her fear. "You're safe." But as she glanced down at Lena's arm, her heart sank. A faint, glowing rash spread across Lena's skin, pulsing softly in time with the sample's light. Over the next 2 days, the crew's condition deteriorated rapidly. Lena's rash worsened, spreading across her body in intricate patterns that mirrored the lattice's structure. She became withdrawn, staring at the sample for hours at a time, mumbling about patterns and signals. Marcus fared no better. Though he showed no visible symptoms, he grew irritable and paranoid, accusing Samir of tampering with the ship's systems. "I know what you're doing," he snapped, his voice trembling. "You're trying to cut me out. I see you watching me." Samir, normally unflappable, began to lose his composure as well. He complained of seeing shadows moving just out of his field of vision, whispering his name. Emily tried to hold the team together, but she was fighting her own demons. The nightmares grew worse, and she began experiencing waking hallucinations. Once she entered the lab and saw the lattice expanding, its tendrils pressing against the containment glass as though trying to break free. She blinked and the vision was gone. Desperate for answers, Emily ran the sample's data through the ship's central computer, cross-referencing every known biological system. The results were chilling. The lattice wasn't just a single organism, it was part of something much larger, something buried deep within the trench. "It's a network," she realized, her voice shaking. "The lattice is just the tip of the iceberg. It's connected to something massive." Lena, her voice weak but tinged with awe, whispered, "It's alive. The whole trench is alive." Emily's stomach churned. The glowing lesions on Lena's body were spreading faster now, emitting faint electrical signals. Marcus and Samir were barely speaking, their eyes bloodshot and hollow. The ship's systems continued to fail, leaving them increasingly isolated, and the lattice, still pulsing in its containment chamber, seemed to grow brighter with every passing hour. The final straw came when Marcus attacked Lena. He'd snapped entirely, accusing her of working with it. Emily arrived just in time to pull him off her, but not before Lena's arm was bruised and bloodied. "It's in your head," Marcus screamed as Emily restrained him. "It's in all of our heads." Later, as Emily patched Lena up, she realized Marcus wasn't entirely wrong. The lattice wasn't just feeding on their fear, it was amplifying it, twisting it, changing them. Emily stared at the glowing organism, her pulse pounding in her ears. It wasn't just a discovery, it was a predator, and they were its prey. The Nereus Explorer was barely alive. Its corridors flickered with sporadic light, the hum of its systems reduced to faint, uneven throbs. The air was heavy, metallic, and tinged with the faint tang of salt, and something else, something decaying. Emily Carter staggered through the dimly lit hallway, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She clutched her side where a hastily applied bandage covered a deep gash Marcus had inflicted during his final frenzied breakdown. The ship felt like a coffin. The walls seemed closer now, bending and groaning under the immense pressure of the ocean. But Emily knew the real threat wasn't the sea outside, it was the organism. The lattice sample in the containment chamber had taken hold of them all. It wasn't just in their minds, it was in their bodies. Lena's lesions glowed so brightly now that Emily had to shield her eyes when looking at her. Marcus was gone, consumed by paranoia and violence, his final screams echoing in Emily's ears. And Samir had simply walked into the ocean, his expression eerily calm as he disappeared into the black. Emily was alone with the thing that had turned her team into monsters. She entered the lab, her hands trembling as she secured the door behind her. The containment chamber stood in the center of the room, its reinforced glass fogged with condensation. Inside, the lattice pulsed with a terrifying vibrancy, its tendrils now visibly pressing against the glass, seeking escape. It had grown larger, more intricate. The pulsing lights along its networked strands moved in patterns as though it were thinking, calculating. Emily stared at it, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. "You've taken everything from me," she whispered, her voice cracking, her hands clenched into fists. "But I won't let you take me." She activated the lab's emergency console, her fingers flying over the controls. The Nereus Explorer's systems were failing, but the lights still worked. If she could reroute the remaining power, she could flood the lab with intense ultraviolet light. It might not destroy the lattice, but it could disrupt it enough for her to escape. The ship groaned beneath her, the sound of its metal frame bending under pressure. The lattice reacted to her movements, its glow intensifying, its tendrils vibrating with an almost anticipatory rhythm. "It knows," she thought. "It knows I'm trying to stop it." Emily's hands trembled as she adjusted the power routing. She had one shot. The UV burst would drain the ship's remaining power, leaving her in total darkness. But darkness didn't scare her anymore. What scared her was the thought of the lattice escaping, of it reaching the surface, spreading, finding new hosts to manipulate. She set the timer for the UV burst. 60 seconds, just enough time to make her way to the escape pod. Her heart hammered as she hit the activation button. The console beeped, the countdown beginning with a series of ominous tones. 60, 59, 58. She turned and bolted from the lab, the sound of her boots echoing in the empty corridor. The ship groaned louder now, the pressure and the organism's influence taking their toll. As she ran, the lights flickered violently, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. 47, 46. Emily passed Lena's cabin and hesitated. The door was ajar, the glow from Lena's body spilling into the hallway. Against her better judgment, she peeked inside. Lena sat on the floor, her back against the wall. Her skin was almost entirely covered in glowing lesions, the patterns pulsating in perfect sync with the lattice in the lab. She turned her head slowly to face Emily, her eyes glowing faintly, her lips curling into a sad, fragile smile. "You can't fight it," Lena said, her voice distant like it was coming from somewhere deep underwater. "It's already won." Emily's throat tightened. "I have to try." Lena nodded weakly. "It's beautiful, isn't it? The patterns, the light, it's everything." For a moment, Emily considered staying, letting the organism take her too. It would be so easy to give up, to stop running. But then she thought of Samir walking into the ocean. Marcus's screams, the promises she'd made to herself and her team. She stepped back into the hallway, forcing herself to turn away from Lena. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. 33 முதல் 32 வரை. The escape pod bay was cold and dark, its fluorescent lights flickering weakly. Emily stumbled toward the pod, her body screaming in protest. Blood seeped through the bandage on her side, but she ignored it. The pain was a reminder that she was still alive, still herself. She climbed into the pod, her hands fumbling with the controls. It took precious seconds to override the locks and prime the launch system. The countdown echoed in her mind, louder than her own ragged breathing. 15, 14. The ship trembled violently. Through the viewport, she saw cracks forming in the walls, seawater seeping through in thin streams. The lattice's influence was everywhere now, its pulsing glow visible even in the distant corridors. 10-9. The pod's engines roared to life, and Emily slammed the launch button. The hatch above her opened with a deafening groan, the pod lurching as it was pushed upward. 6, 5. She glanced through the pod's rear window. The lab was directly below her, its walls bathed in the lattice's light. Then the UV burst activated. A blinding flash filled the ship, engulfing the lattice and everything around it. Emily shielded her eyes as the light seared into her retinas. 3, 2, 1. The pod shot upward, the force pressing her back against her seat. Through the viewport, she saw the Nereus Explorer implode in on itself, swallowed by the crushing blackness of the trench. Emily broke through the surface hours later, the pod bobbing violently in the waves. She lay back in her seat, her body shaking with sobs of relief and exhaustion. The sun was rising, its golden light painting the ocean in colors she hadn't seen in days. She reached for the emergency beacon and activated it. The signal would bring rescue ships, but it would also bring questions. Questions she wasn't sure how to answer. Her hands trembled as she looked down at her arm. Faint lines glowed beneath her skin, their pulsing rhythm matching her heartbeat. It's not over, she thought. Not for me. As the waves lapped against the pod, she stared out at the endless ocean, haunted by the knowledge of what lay beneath. The lattice was gone, but the trench remained, waiting, watching, and Emily knew deep in her bones that it wasn't finished.